Hey, I'm Andrea, and this video is about the Kansas City Royals and what they might do at the trade deadline. The Royals are in last place in the AL Central, and they're 21 games back in the wild card. They're still in the process of their rebuild. So starting out, we're going to look at some players that are going to be free agents at the end of this season. So first, we'll start out with Aroldis Chapman, and given how high the need is for relief pitchers this deadline, I do expect Chapman to be moved. In 28 innings pitched in relief, he has a 2.54 ERA. He's in the top 1% of the league with his elite 43% strikeout rate. But the catch is that his control continues to be a problem. He's got a really poor walk rate at 17%. And he's got a two-pitch arsenal, a four-seam and a slider. That four-seam he throws hard, like 98 to 101 miles an hour. And it also has above average ride. And that slider he also throws hard at like 86 to 90, and it gets above average sweep. But overall, he's done a good job of limiting hard contact and missing bats. His zone contact rate is elite. It's only 60%. What's Chapman's trade value? Well, to figure that out, we can compare his situation to a trade from 2021, and that was Craig Kimbrel for Nick Madrigal and Cody Hoyer. And at the time, Kimbrel was also a rental, and the Cubs got two major league players back. Both of those players, Hoyer and Madrigal, had around 1 year of service at the time. So I think Chapman may get a similar return in terms of overall value. Maybe not exactly like two players with 1 year of service, but it may look something like that, or something like a prospect who's expected to have major league value plus like an MLB player with 2 to 3 years of service, let's say. Next up, we have Brad Keller, who's on the 15-day IL with right shoulder impingement syndrome, according to MLB.com. But he did start a rehab assignment and is expected to be back in mid-July. Prior to that injury, though, he wasn't doing very well. He had a 4.36 ERA and a 20% walk rate, so even worse than Chapman's walk rate, through 43 innings pitched. And that performance in part was due to a velocity dip, which I think was related to that shoulder soreness he was experiencing. However, Keller's never been like a top starter, but he has done a good job of getting ground balls, especially this season. He's got a 57% ground ball rate, which is a career high for him. I think he's getting that high ground ball rate and like different results because he changed his pitch mix a bit this season. He started throwing a curveball 19% of the time. He dropped the usage of his sinker from 23% to 11%, and he stopped throwing his slider to left-handed hitters in favor of that curveball. His four-seam is his primary pitch against left-handed hitters, and it gets a high ground ball rate of 58%. He also added 6 inches of sweep to his slider this season, which is his primary pitch against right-handed hitters. And that movement increase may have been helped a little bit by that 2-mile-per-hour dip in velocity that we mentioned earlier. And compared to 2022, that slider is resulting in significantly less damage. So last year, it had a 437 xSlug against, and this year it's all the way down to 319. So what's Keller's trade value? Well, because of his injury concerns and his performance so far, I don't think that the Royals are going to get a huge return from him. But this is a similar trade we could use to try to get an idea. So this is Mike Minor and cash for 2 players from the Athletics to be named later. This trade's from 2020, and through the deadline that year, Minor was performing similarly to Keller. He had an ERA that was a little high at 5.48, but he had an average walk rate and was fully healthy. So it's possible Keller can get a similar return. It's going to depend on what he looks like in his rehab starts and as he comes back from injury to the major league team. Next up, we have relief pitcher Amir Garrett, who's also on the 15-day IL, though he has an elbow injury. He's also expected to return mid-July, and he started his rehab assignment last week. Prior to his injury, he had a career-best 3 ERA, but just like Chapman and Keller, he also has an incredibly high walk rate at 18%. And that 3 ERA is also a little bit misleading because his expected ERA, which is his ERA based on like the quality of contact, that's much higher at 4.72%. And he has a hard hit rate against of 46%, which is 10% worse than MLB average. He has 3 pitches, a slider, a sinker, and a four-seam, and that four-seam is mixed in primarily against left-handed batters. So what's Garrett's trade value? This is a similar trade that I found. It's Joakim Soria for 2 players from Toronto to be named later. Soria was also a rental at the time, and prior to the trade, Soria also spent like about a month on the injured list, so very similar situations. He had a 4.30 ERA, which is similar to Garrett's 4.72 expected ERA. However, Soria had a much better walk rate. Before we move to our final player, I just want to note that Zach Greinke is also going to be a free agent at the end of the season, but he has a full no-trade clause. And he's historically been very picky about where he wants to play, so I don't expect him to waive that clause. especially not for like a middle or large market team. So the last player is not a rental, but I do think he's still an interesting target based on how he's done this year. And that's Scott Barlow. He's a relief pitcher with 2.5 years remaining under team control. He's got a much more reasonable walk rate. Through 28 innings pitched, his ERA is 4.39 and that walk rate is 12%. It's still worse than average, though it's better than the other guys we looked at. But consistently throughout his career, Barlow's had like average control. And that ERA is also not representative of how well he's been doing at limiting hard contact. His 3.35 expected ERA is over a run better than that actual ERA. He also has an elite hard hit rate against at 27% and a really high strikeout at 33%. And both of those stats, the hard hit rate against and the strikeout rate, put him in the top 3% and 6% of the league, respectively. He's got 3 pitches, a slider, a curveball, and a four-seam. He mixes all 3 to each hand, but he uses that curveball a lot more against lefties and the slider a lot more against righties. And he's relied on chase a lot for his success throughout his career, which, it doesn't matter, but it's just something to note that his stuff doesn't get a ton of miss in zone, but he gets a lot more chase than average. But what is Barlow's trade value? Well, it's a lot harder to find an exact trade to compare him to because he has that 2.5 years of team control remaining, but I think we could take an educated guess based on a couple of other trades. So first we have this one, which is Brad Hand for Riley Adams, which was a rental for a prospect. Brad Hand was the rental at the time. He had an ERA that was 3.59, which is similar to Barlow's 3.35 expected ERA. And that return, Riley Adams was the 17th best prospect in the Blue Jays system according to MLB Pipeline. So since Hand was a rental, we can expect that Barlow would get the Royals a little bigger of a return. This next trade is Miguel Castro for Kevin Smith and a player to be named later. At the time that this trade was made, Castro had 3.5 years of service time remaining, meaning he had 1 more year than Barlow has now. Castro had a 4.02 ERA with Baltimore, and he had a walk rate that was similar to Barlow's at 14%. And that return, Kevin Smith was the 12th best prospect in the Mets system according to MLB Pipeline. And then plus the Mets also threw in a player to be named later. So based on these trades, I think we can get a general idea for what the Royals might be able to get for Barlow, which is a prospect who is ranked 10 to 20 on a good team, plus a lottery ticket prospect. But again, because Barlow has 2.5 years of team control remaining, the Royals don't have to trade him. What do you think the Royals are going to do this deadline? If you like this video, please subscribe and follow me on Twitter at Scalper Report. Thanks for watching!